Welcome to the Keeping It Israel podcast with Jeff Feuders, where Jeff and his guests talk everything Israel as it relates to Christian faith and the church. If you are a Christian and you stand with Israel, you will be encouraged and challenged by this podcast. And if you're not so sure about the whole Israel thing, you need to learn how your faith connects with Israel and why standing with Israel matters. Now here's Jeff with today's guest.
Welcome to the podcast today. And we are continuing in our series on Gene Binder's book, Connecting the Dots. And we have been letting you know where you can pick that up. We will remind you again today as to how you can get that book and how you can get that information. But I want to welcome Gene back to the podcast. Gene, welcome back.
Hey, it's great to be back again.
And just for those who might be just jumping in today, of course, we want to encourage you, if you haven't listened to the first 3 episodes, you can go back and get those. But Gene, give us a bit of a recap of where we've been so far. We did an intro the first week, and then we've covered 2 of the foreshadows that we've been talking about. So just kind of recap for us today.
Okay. Well, first of all, the book is really, it looks at the Bible and all of history as one beautiful, seamless love story, not 2 stories, not a Jewish story that became a Christian story, but one beautiful, seamless love story from the beginning of Genesis to the end of Revelation and beyond, as we find out that there's a 3rd episode that is beyond this world. And if you were to get up about 30,000 feet and get a drone's eye view of history, you'd be able to see that it's one beautiful, seamless story. And what this book does is it looks at the role that the Jewish people play throughout the entire story, and that is revealed in what we call 7 foreshadows. And I'll go through them again, the 7 foreshadows, because they're in a logical order. They make sense when you hear it. Most people go, "Oh yeah, that makes perfect sense." And there's 7 of them. There's not 6, and there's not 8. There's 7 of them, and I think when you hear them, you'll say, "Yeah, that about sums it up." I don't think I could fit one in. I don't think I could take one away, and that's important. So it starts with a covenant that God comes to this 75-year-old, probably toothless, childless nomad named Abram and his wife Sarah, and makes a covenant with them. And we look at the covenant as a marriage proposal. God uses that kind of language, calls himself a husband, but it's not. The marriage doesn't happen. And all of these foreshadows reveal themselves in 3 episodes, like a trilogy. And in that first episode, we're really looking at an engagement of the covenant. It looks like the marriage is off. Israel's unfaithful. It's back on again through the blood of Yeshua. And then there's the wedding feast in that 3rd episode, which is New Jerusalem. And so once you have the covenant is a marriage. Once you have marriage, you have kids. That's the nation of Israel. That's the family. And then once you have marriage and you have kids, you need a place to live. That's the promised land. That's the piece of property that God promised to Abe and his descendants. And so you have a marriage, you have kids, you have a place to live. Now you need a healthy set of rules to live by. That's the Torah. Most people call it the law. It's probably not the best English translation of that word. Teaching, instruction is a much better word. And then today we're going to look at the temple and how that plays in its 3 episodes. All of these foreshadows play in those 3 episodes. Each one tells the gospel story in a unique way, and the temple is no exception. That's what we're going to look at today. The temple is the overall story is God's plan to build an eternal family. This is God's plan. The temple is God's plan to give his kids access to him. A smart father knows to give his kids plenty of access. And that's what the temple foreshadow is about.
All right. Well, that's great. And we look forward to covering that today. Now, we have up till now covered covenant and the Torah. We're kind of jumping today over the family Israel and the promised land. And I don't apologize for that. I want people to go and buy your book so that they can get all of this information. And by the way, if you're listening and you think that, you're going to get everything, even from these foreshadows, all the information on these podcasts, you're not. We're having a conversation, and Gene is kind of giving us an overview, a bit of a 30,000-foot view of all of these topics. But if you really want to get into the meat and the heart of it, you need to go out and buy the book. And we'll put just a little post in here now. Gene, again, what's the website where people can get that?
Bold Journey, that's all together, .com/books. So books is plural. And there you'll see more information and how to purchase the book.
Okay, great. And we'll come back to that information at the end of the podcast as well. But today we're going to talk about the temple. And there is, lots of information out there about the temple. This is, I don't think this is going to be a detailed walkthrough of all the elements and all of those kinds of things. But we're going to look at this idea that the temple foreshadows something that God is doing with his family, that God is doing through the story of the gospel, from the temple in the Old Testament all the way through to future times. And so, Gene, with that little bit of introduction, tell us about this foreshadow of the temple.
Okay, and you said it well. I mean, normally when you think about looking at the temple as a foreshadow, you look at all the individual items in the tabernacle or in the temple. Tabernacle was the wilderness, and then when it became a permanent structure in Jerusalem, it became more as a temple. And there's lots of great stuff out there on this, and we'll get a little bit of that, but really this is looking at the bigger picture. What was this thing trying to communicate? What was God trying to communicate with this structure that he first had Moses build in the wilderness as they wandered for 40 years? And so, Moses, through God, persuades Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. They pass through the Dead Sea or the Red Sea, and 50 days later, Moses ends up on Mount Sinai, and God gives him the Torah. We looked at that last week. But one of the things in the Torah we find, and this is in Exodus 25, verse 8 and 9. And this is what God says to Moses. He says, "Have them," meaning the Israelites, "make me a sanctuary, that I might dwell among them." And he says, "Make this tabernacle in all of its furnishings exactly to the pattern I will show you." Now, most of the time when this is read, and at least my experience, I don't know, maybe you've had this experience too, you just jump right over this and you get to the stuff that's in it, all the details in it. And but there is so much in these two verses that if you pass by too quickly, you'll get to some cool stuff, but you're going to miss really God's intent for this structure. So just, we don't, since we're on a podcast, I know you also do this on YouTube, but you're going to have to just visualize this in your mind. This structure ends up being about 50 feet wide and 100 feet long. And it's only one entrance into it. And so you go into that entrance and you have the altar and the laver where you wash your hands. And then you go into these two structures. The first, like a tent, right? It's got two rooms. And the first one is called the holy place. And inside there, you've got the menorah, which is Hebrew for lamp. And you got the showbread. And then you've got the the most holy place, which has the Ark of the Covenant, and of course, inside the ark was the staff that budded and the broken tablets. And, yeah, so it's it's an interesting place, and you think about this guy. What is God trying to communicate here? Well, let's dive in and look at some of the words that are used in these two verses, Exodus 25, 8 through 9, because they're telling. They're very telling. And so he says, have them, the Israelites, make me a sanctuary. And that is the Hebrew word mikdash. Mikdash. The word for holy is kadosh. And a lot of times, if you've sang some Hebraic worship, you've sang this word kadosh, holy. So have them make me a sanctuary. So they're built off the same root. Most of Hebrew is a three-letter root system, and you start with these three letters, and then you build words from it. And as you build from it, you keep the original meaning. And this is true for these two words as well. And so, kadosh, really, you're getting down almost to the root here with kadosh. It means to be holy or set apart. And when you get to the word mikdash, which describes the sanctuary or the temple, you ask yourself, well, what is it? Well, it's a holy place. So why did God need a holy place? Well, the logical answer is because God's holy. Mm-hmm. And he needs a place. Really, it's not so much for him, it's for us. He needs a place to shelter where we can tolerate his presence because we're not holy. And anything that's not holy, that gets in the presence of something that is holy, it's not going to go well for the thing that's unholy. And so God said, make me this sanctuary, this mikdash, and he says that I might dwell among them. So the word for dwell is the word shakan. Shakan. And we get some other words from this. Like, for instance, the word tabernacle that is used mostly of this walled off area is called a mishkan, a mishkan. So you can hear how they're built from the same root, shakan, mishkan. The word for neighbor is shaken. So you got shakan, mishkan, shaken, you get to neighbor. And then you get the word for neighborhood is shkuna. So it's a mouthful to pronounce, but it's built off the same three letters, although there's more letters added. So to dwell is shakan, tabernacle is mishkan, neighbor is shaken, neighborhood is shkuna. And then most of your listeners will probably remember, when you go and you if you've ever been to a class or you go on the internet and you Google tabernacle or a sanctuary, wilderness tabernacle, you usually get a picture of this 50-foot by 100-foot wall structure in the desert. And somewhere in that back room, you got the holy place and the most holy place, is this fire that's coming up through that back holy place. And we call that, you know what that's called? It's called the
Shekinah.
The Shekinah, yeah. It's interesting. That word is not in the Bible. That comes from, it comes from the Hebrew scholars. It's feminine as well. So we won't go into that, but that's, it's his divine presence. It's the word that the Hebrew sages gave this, the Shekinah glory. And no one disputes it. I mean, it's a good name for it. But the fact that it's related to all these other words makes it interesting. So to dwell, shakan, tabernacle, mishkan, neighbor, shaken, neighborhood, shkuna. And the way you actually pronounce Shekinah in Hebrew is shkina. So neighborhood is shkuna, and the divine presence is shkina. And so Okay, what do these words mean? I want to show you, see if I can find this. Well, it's in Hebrews chapter 8. We're told, it's right in the very beginning, Hebrews chapter 8, that the priests serve in a sanctuary that is a pattern. Oh, actually, I forgot the most important thing. So, you know how God says in that second sentence, make this tabernacle and all of its furnishings exactly to the pattern I will show you. Hebrews chapter 8 answers the question, why is this important? So it says that the priests serve in a sanctuary that is a shadow of the real sanctuary that's in heaven. And then it says, this is why God said, make these exactly to the pattern I will show you. So think about this. It's an amazing statement, because basically what we find out in Exodus 25:8, and then what we get more elaboration in Hebrews chapter 8, is that whatever this tabernacle is doing, it is reflecting something that's really happening in real time in the heavenly tabernacle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So do we not assume, but do we think that perhaps when it says that this is a shadow, is this just sort of a small mini model of something that's actually physically in heaven?
In every way
Or
possible.
what's that?
Yeah, okay, say the or. I'm sorry. I thought you were going to
Or
end
I
it.
was going to say, or is it just a sort of a picture of the way things are in heaven in terms of access to God's presence? Help me out with that, because I think there's some interesting implications there.
Well, I mean, you think about it, what was the tabernacle doing mostly? It was mostly a place for sacrifice.
Hmm.
And and most of it was blood sacrifice. You know,
Okay.
Hebrews 9 says that the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sins. And so this is this becomes like a factory almost, where sin is forgiven. I mean, there's lots, and we can really get into all the detail of all the mitzvot, the commandments that describe the different types of sacrifices taking place. But let's just fast forward to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, because in that back room was God's presence. And only once a year could a high priest enter that back room. And he had to go through this very ritual cleansing, because, there was this great fear that he wouldn't survive the experience. In fact, there's a lot of legend around tying a rope to his leg just in case he didn't survive, because no one's going in there to get him. They're going to pull him out.
Right. Sure. We've all heard that.
And
Yeah.
and what does he do? I mean, so he goes, for Yom Kippur, you take the blood of a goat or bull, you take it, you go into the holy place, to the most holy place, you splatter the blood of this animal on the mercy seat of God. I love it, the mercy seat of God. And then, the high priest, he only can do that once a year on Yom Kippur, and he comes out, and there's this sigh of relief. It was a national day of forgiveness. It wasn't individual, it was national. They're all waiting outside the tabernacle or the temple to see that God accepted this, and there's this collective sigh. We're good for another year.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And
Yeah. Right.
what were they good for? They were good for access to God. I mean, there's this barrier between us and God. We're not holy, God is holy. And for in the Jewish world, you become holy once a year through the blood of the lamb, the bulls, the shed blood. Okay, and this is why I say this is God's The temple is God's plan to give access to him. Now, it's not very good access. I mean, I don't think it is really in this first episode. God hides out in this back room, and only the high priest could go in there, really, and only once a year. And you don't really get any closer to God, but you can have confidence that for a year you don't have to worry about the consequences of being unholy. You're basically covered for a year. But the beauty of this is, to ask the question, what is God trying to do with this? What is he creating? So I just want to spend a little bit and talk about the picture that this tabernacle creates if we get up, at 30,000 feet, drone's eye view, and look at this. Like I said, if you go on the internet, you're gonna see pictures of tabernacles. Most of them show a tabernacle 50 feet wide, 100 feet long, and the two rooms, and the golden altar of sacrifice in the front, and the laver where you wash your hands, and that kind of stuff. And then you'll see most of the pictures, you'll see around the circumference of the temple, you'll see the tribes of Israel encircling the tabernacle. And most of the pictures, I've only found one, and I actually have permission from an artist to use it. I've only seen one that shows what it really would look like, because how many people do you estimate left Egypt with Moses and entered into the wilderness? What's your estimate on that?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot here. Would
I'm
it be?
having a good time then.
Hey, yeah, now you're having a good time. I'm gonna take a stab in the dark from numbers that I've heard. Okay. Maybe between a million and 1.5 million.
Yeah, actually probably between 1 million and at least 2 million.
2 million.
It says there were about 700,000 men. So when you start adding the women, we get that number from the scriptures. But if you start adding the women and the children, it's not hard to get to a couple million people. So, and God gave specific instructions. He said, look, okay, Judah, you are going to camp right here. And Benjamin, you are going to camp right here. And all the 12 tribes had a place to camp around the perimeter of the walls. So now take that number, let's just say 1 million. So let's just forget the 2 million. Let's just say 1 million, or easily 1 million when you get women and kids, but it's probably closer to 2 or 3 million. What's that going to look like?
It's going to look like a city with a tent in the middle.
A sea of people, a city a massive city. And the question is, what is God trying to communicate? When they make it to, through the wilderness, and eventually, through King Solomon, he builds a permanent temple in Jerusalem. Do you know it's the same pattern? Only it's spread out more. Judah, you're here. Benjamin, you're here. And it makes, if you look at an overhead of it and you look at where they're at, they're circling around the temple. And what is God after? Well, let's look at these words again. To dwell is Shechem. Tabernacle, Mishkan. Neighbor is Shechem. Neighborhood, Shkuna. That flame that comes out is the Shekinah. But what is it really? It's the neighborhood lamppost, right? You need light. Where's the electricity in the wilderness? How are they going to get light in this massive city? It was the neighborhood lamppost. Every neighborhood, back us up several generations to where we don't have a whole lot of electricity. The city square was lit by this massive torch at night. And so what is God trying to do? If you just, please, if you're just listening, just picture the tabernacle and a sea of people, different tribes located around the perimeter. It's all you can see, as far as you can see, is a bunch of people. And what is God after? If we take these words, he's after a neighborhood where he's in the center and all of his kids are camped around him. This is what he's after. Now, it's not so good in the first episode, right? He's got to kind of hang out in that back room. He came out when they made camp, and you follow the cloud by day or the light by night, but it's still kind of awkward. What happens in the second episode? Instead of having to come once a year for Yom Kippur, Yeshua shows up, right? And really, if you read Hebrews 8 through 10, you're going to find out that the only thing Jesus changes with Yom Kippur is that you don't have to come once a year over and over again. And that Jesus didn't bring blood from bulls and goats. And he didn't enter a man-made temple. He entered a heavenly temple, the one that this is patterned after. And he only entered once by his own blood, once and for all. That's the beauty of this temple, and that's the beauty of Yom Kippur. If you've never studied Yom Kippur, listening audience, read about it, and then go read Hebrews 8 through 10, and you'll understand the context of what that writer is writing about. It's probably Paul, but you'll understand the context of what happened when Yeshua entered into that heavenly temple, the one that is the real temple, the earthly temple just shadowing. And that's the big picture. And so when we get to the second episode, there's a huge shift about where the temple is located.
There is, yeah. Now I want to pause there for a second, because you get to the second episode, and John begins it this way. He talks about how the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Tabernacled among us is one of the translations I've heard. I love what the Message or paraphrase says. Eugene Peterson says that God moved into the neighborhood, and it was the neighborhood word that I sort of tweaked on when you were talking earlier. This whole idea of the incarnation really is God taking this now to the next level, isn't it?
It really is. And I love Eugene Peterson, and I love the Message. It's a great contribution for us to be able to see it, expounded more. It's more of a commentary than it is a literal translation. So, every time you have a commentary, it's not going to be perfect, but yeah, I tend to lean more on Mr. Rogers.
Yes.
You know who Mr. Rogers is?
I do. What a great movie that came out, a couple of years ago.
Oh, yeah.
About his life, but yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, a documentary, because Mr. Rogers, he's a Presbyterian pastor who said, I want kids to understand God's neighborhood. And that's what he really patterned his show after, a place where perfect love existed and everybody felt valued and accepted. And, and when I teach on this, I always pull up his song, it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, won't you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? And I thought somehow or another, Mr. Rogers got a hold of a rabbi or a Messianic Jew who shared some of this stuff from a Jewish perspective. But I didn't know it for sure until that documentary, because in that documentary, you get to the very last scene where it's his last recorded words. And he's summarizing the meaning of life. And he says, the meaning of life is tikkun olam. And it just blew my mind. I go, wait, how does he know about this word? Tikkun olam is a mandate that we Jews have given to ourselves. And it literally translates to heal or repair the world. that it's broken and it needs to be repaired. And the fact that this Presbyterian teacher used those two words, tikkun olam, tells me that he got a hold of something that showed him that God's plan for the tabernacle was to create the most incredible neighborhood in the world. So the amazing thing, when we get to the second episode, the location of the temple changes. You know, it's no longer a tent, and it's no longer God hiding in the back room where only the priest can come in there once a year. And even then, you know, it was always risky to do so. I mean, through the blood of Yeshua, the temple is relocated. And where is it now? It's here. It's in our hearts. I mean, 1 Corinthians 3:16 says, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? See, there's that word dwell again. That word dwelling, you brought it up so well in John chapter 1. God's plan, his ultimate plan, is to dwell among us perfectly. In the second half of the episode, God's dwelling in us. He calls us the temple where he dwells, and it's better, you know, but I mean, I have confidence now. Hebrews chapter 10 says we have confidence to approach God through the blood of Yeshua. So it's better. We're not worried about God doing something to us. We're made holy through the blood of Yeshua. But I don't know about you, Jeff, but you know, if you follow me around for any length of time, you're going to see that I still blow it all the time. So it's not perfect yet.
Well, yeah, no, no, I'm not perfect yet either. I was gonna, you know, make some joke about how that I'm getting close, but really no, not even, remotely close. So I get what you're saying.
No, I mean, we have the Holy Spirit living in us, and you know, if we stay in tune, in step with that Spirit, you know, he moves us down the road. We can get down the road. Some of us get down the road further than others, but you know, nobody hits the bullseye. Nobody can do that in this lifetime. But that's where we get to the third episode. God has a plan to make it better. You know, the temple's a big deal in Jewish life. I know that you take trips to Israel, so you know how important the temple is. It was destroyed in 70 A.D., and Jesus predicted that destruction. And the Jewish people have wanted to rebuild the temple a third time ever since then. It's interesting that God has kept that from happening, and the way it's kept it from happening for most of that time was it was occupied by people that didn't want a temple to be there. And now that, you know, in 1967, the Jews reoccupied Jerusalem, but they still couldn't get the Temple Mount where the temple could be rebuilt. And to this day, there is no third temple. There is a group called the Temple Institute. They have already refashioned all the articles that go into that temple. And as soon as there's a green light, they're going to rebuild the temple. Here's my eschatological take on it. I don't think there's going to be a third temple built in this lifetime. I mean, maybe there might be. So please, I'm not holding that super tight. And the reason I say this, God doesn't need it. That doesn't mean there won't be an attempt to rebuild it. And if there's an attempt to rebuild it, all of you know what's going to break loose in the Middle East, because that one spot is the epicenter of the universe. You know, some people say that, you know, Israel is the epicenter of the universe, Jerusalem's the epicenter of Israel, and the Temple Mount, though, is the epicenter of Jerusalem. The whole world is all fighting over this one spot, and you can't get it out of the headlines. And I don't think that there'll be a successful third temple built in this lifetime, but John, in the book of Revelation, is given a sneak peek at this third episode. And in chapter 21, verse 22 through 23, and let me remind you how this chapter starts. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old heaven and the old earth had disappeared, right? And then we see New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. So what we get is a merging of heaven and earth. That's what eternity is going to be like. And so we don't go up to heaven Heaven actually comes down to us, and we have this new thing. But then it says, for now the tabernacle of the dwelling of God is with man, and he shall dwell among him. We have reached God's ultimate purpose for the tabernacle. He's going to dwell with us. But John, who's Jewish, gets a picture of this thing, and he describes it well, right? And when we get to verse 22, he says, he's a good Jew. He's expecting to see the temple, right? You can't really have the culmination of all things unless there's a temple. And he says, this is how he starts the sentence out. I did not see the temple. Like, I'm looking around and there's no temple here. I see the streets of gold. I see everything else. Where's the temple? But he's being a little facetious here. He says, I did not see the temple because, and this is an amazing thing, the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb, meaning Jesus, are its temple. Now, I don't know how that's going to look or how that's going to play out, but it's probably not going to look or play out anything like we can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
But then he says, the city does not need the sun or the moon to shine in it. So it needs no cosmic lighting at all. Because the glory of God, the Shekinah of God, the Shekinah of God gives its light. And this is the part I love the most. And those of you that study the temple will love this too. And the Lamb, meaning Jesus, is its lamp. Now, what is the Hebrew word for lamp? Menorah.
Mm-hmm.
That menorah sat in the holy place, and it had to stay lit 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. There was a priest that had to sleep underneath it just to make sure that the oil stayed lit. This is why Hanukkah is such an important life in Judaism, because they only had it when they got the temple back. There was not enough oil. They had special oil they had to use, and it was going to take something like 7 days to make it. And the lamp stayed lit with that 1 day of oil for all of those days.
Mm-hmm.
But it overshadowed the 12 loaves of bread, the showbread. This is the lamp that stays lit forever over the people of God. It's a foreshadow of what's going to take place in heaven. Jesus is the menorah that stays lit forever, and we get all of our light from God in Yeshua. I have no idea what that's going to look like. I just know that it's going to be the most amazing neighborhood that's ever existed. A perfect neighborhood.
And would you be my neighbor? That's a great question. This is beautiful, and you referenced, in that second episode, you referenced Yom Kippur and kind of all of the meaning that happens there in the Old Testament, and how Yeshua, Jesus, comes and fulfills all of that. One of the things I love about studying these different things is how that Yeshua is not just one part. He's not just a fulfillment of one specific thing. He fulfills everything. He's, so in the Day of Atonement, Yeshua, Jesus, he's not just the high priest. He's also the sacrifice. He's also the access to God. He's the one who goes in on our behalf. He's also the scapegoat. Yeshua is everything. Yes. And so it's not surprising, I guess I would say, that as we get to that second episode, that the temple becomes Jesus in our hearts, and that eventually Jesus and God are the temple in the culmination of history in the last days. What a phenomenal picture. And I think that if people are listening and just kind of catching this for the first time, and I mentioned earlier, and you reiterated the fact that this talk really wasn't going to be about all of the individual elements in the temple, but more of a talk about the temple itself and how it impacts. And what an amazing way to sort of bring it all together when we get to the final episode, And as you brought that out, that there will be no need for the light because no need for the temple. First of all, John didn't see the temple because God and the Lamb are the temple.
Yeah.
But also that idea that Jesus is the light is man. There's just imagery being fulfilled all over the place here, and what a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Well, and that's where the name connecting the dots comes from. There are so many dots to connect. And your listeners should know in 2 weeks we're going to look at the feast, and we're going to really drill down more on what we just talked about with Yom Kippur and all the feasts and how they point also to the gospel story in a beautiful way. But this one I love it because it ends again. We said it in an earlier podcast. It's we're not all going to be Jewish up there, right? It's not a monoculture.
Mhm.
It's a very plural culture. We've got every tongue, every tribe, every nation. This is going to be the most magnificent family that's ever existed. And here's the great part. We'll all get along. We'll all live in perfect harmony because Jesus and God are at the center of this, and all of his kids are around him. And there's no need for sacrifice because there's no one's doing anything wrong anymore. We're all holy in God's presence. I can't wait.
Amazing.
I'm ready.
Amazing. What a phenomenal picture. And if you're listening, you don't know enough about this, you need to know more about this, get in touch with us. Call, email, ask some questions because you can be a part of this family, right, Gene?
Yes.
It's easy.
It's so easy that it's hard, right? You just believe. You just put your faith in this incredible story, in the hero of the story who comes and atones for your sins and declares us holy and blameless in God's sight. There's no contract to sign. There's no money to pay. It's really just about believing. And it's so easy that it's so difficult for people but anyone can do it. And you don't have to have a pastor or a priest lead you in this. Right now, wherever you're at, you could just say, wow, maybe you've never heard that story before or didn't know that it was just really about faith. And you could just say, yes, God, yes, Jesus, I believe it. This is an incredible story. And I'm in it. You're in the story whether you like it or not. You might as well be in it in a way that it makes sense. And there's no better sense to be made than to see how you fit into God's story, because that's a big deal. We all contribute to moving God's story down to its eventual conclusion. Just say yes.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. I like that. In it, you might as well be in it in a way that makes sense. That's really good teaching, as a friend of mine would say. But this thing about Old Testament, we read the Old Testament account and it seems so distant, the relationship, the tabernacle, that only the high priest can go in and it's a temporary covering of sin and so on. But when Jesus died on the cross, one of the things I love about that account is that at the moment, he gave up the ghost and the earth shook and the thunder rolled and everything, that the veil, that obstacle that was between the holy place and the Holy of Holies was torn into from top to bottom, not the other way around, so that I always heard it explained so that nobody could say that it was sort of done physically by human effort, that this veil was so thick that it would be impossible to tear it that way, for humans to take care of that. God himself, through Jesus, gives access into his presence to the very Holy of Holies. And like you said, now in this age of messianic fulfillment, we have confidence. Hebrews tells us we can go boldly to the throne of grace, and there we can find help in our time of need, that Jesus intercedes on our behalf. He's the go-between. But one day we will be in the presence of God, and God himself and the Lamb will be the temple. Beautiful, beautiful picture. And thanks for sharing it with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. I love all these foreshadows. Some catch my heart more than others, but they're all amazing. This one definitely is a heart catcher.
Yeah, for sure.
We'll see Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, well, you know what? I believe he's there. I think that
he's probably leading that song. Let's sing it. It's a beautiful day.
That's great. That's awesome. Well, Gene, thank you for being with us today. Let people know what we're going to hear about next week, and then we'll sign off for this podcast.
Yeah, next week we are looking at the Sabbath. And its meaning. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the Sabbath, that it's hard and it's, it's something that, we really shouldn't be doing. It's a Jewish thing. It's not a Christian thing, but it's another beautiful foreshadow. This one tells the gospel story in the most amazing way. And so come on back next week and hear how it tells that story.
All right, great. Well, you heard him. Come back next week. And Gene, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us for the podcast today. And what an amazing teaching session we have had from Gene today about access to the Father, and how that the temple, the picture of the temple, really helps us to understand God's plan for his family to have access to him, for his kids to have access to him as a dad. And I just hope that you picked up so much out of that. An amazing thing to think about the presence of God, and how that we can come right into the presence of God now because of Jesus, because of Yeshua, and how that God has moved into the neighborhood. And this is the most amazing neighborhood. I think that's just been an incredible picture that Gene has painted for us. And if you've not seen the movie, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, the story of Mr. Rogers, you really need to check that out. And this will give you a different insight again into what Mr. Rogers was trying to accomplish in his television show, in his life, in his work, in his ministry. I want to also mention to you, we talked about Yom Kippur and about the amazing truths that we find in Yom Kippur, the way that Jesus fulfills so much of that. If you're interested in knowing more about that, there is a teaching on our website, our YouTube channel, I should say, First Century Foundation's YouTube channel, and you can go and check that out. We'll put a link in the description below this video, and you can find it that way if you want to check it out. And of course, we'll hear more about that in a couple of weeks with Gene as well. I think those are most of the things that I wanted to just mention. Don't forget to go and get Gene's book, and you can do that at boldjourney.com/books. boldjourney.com/books, and he tells me you'll get the best deal there, and you should go check that out. There's also a Kindle version that's available on Amazon, as we have mentioned to you before. I just wanted to make sure you know that. Hey, listen, we are actively involved in coming alongside, holding up the hands, and equipping the ministries in the land of Israel, the leaders in the ministries there. If you can help us with that, if you enjoy this podcast, if you watch our TV show, if you're blessed and ministered to by these things, then please, would you go to our website, firstcenturyfoundations.com/donate. And there you can make a donation either in Canada or the US. You can be receipted for your donation. We are a registered charity in both places. And you would just be helping us so much to assist the ministries there in the land of Israel to do the work that God has called them to do. And I would just be so grateful if you would do that. Thanks for tuning in today. And remember, as Christians, we stand with Israel.